When referring to BOLOs, most resellers are usually talking about brands that you should be on the lookout for because they sell really well online. And most of the BOLOs that are talked about are modern brands. So, what about vintage brands that also sell really well? Hey everyone, my name is Bethany, and I, along with my husband Sean, run Trash Pandas Thrift. We are a six-figure reselling business, and here on this channel, we share with you all of our tips, tricks, and experiences, also that you can start and grow your very own reselling business too. Today, I have got a good BOLO video for you guys. I think it's probably one of the first times we've ever done it here on this channel. And if you've never seen or watched our content before, here at Trash Pandas Thrift, we are lovers of all things that sell really well online, and especially vintage. Vintage, I feel like across the reseller landscape, is often an untapped category. Even myself, a few years ago, I was one of those people that I was so scared to pick up a vintage brand or a vintage item to resell online because I didn't know the first thing about, number one, what's even in demand with vintage pieces, and number two, how do I sell them? So let's dive into these three BOLOs I have for you guys today. We're going to talk about what brands they are, what categories to look out for, and how to get actual more money when you're reselling these vintage brands, and maybe even more that you have in your own store online. Let's jump right in. So the first brand I want to talk about is going to be Vintage Wilsons. So when I'm talking about Vintage Wilsons, I'm specifically talking about outerwear. I'm thinking about materials like leather and suede, specifically in jackets. And now, this is so perfect for right now, the season we're currently in. It is winter. And if you're out there, you're sourcing, and you know the competition is fierce. Competition is out in full force for all of the best winter gear. I'm talking jackets, coats, puffers, sweaters. Everyone is looking out for the best brands to resell online. Everyone wants the best jackets. Even myself. We're fighting some heavy competition right now at the Goodwill outlet every time we go, and I'm fighting as best as I can to get those good jackets to resell right now especially. And if you're someone who you cannot find these great BOLO brand jackets to resell online, really lean into vintage jackets this fall and this winter. It is its own category that's blown up hugely. It is a huge trend alone for vintage outerwear, especially when it comes to leather and suede jackets. When I sat down to write the notes for this video, I thought to myself, okay, what is the number one brand that I wish I could find every single time I went sourcing when it came to vintage jackets? Easy. It is Vintage Wilsons. They make some beautiful pieces. They make really sleek and chic leather jackets, and they are so on trend this winter, whether they're longer styles or shorter, more bomber styles. They also make some really fun, trendy styles that are super retro, especially with fur liner, and that's been a huge trend this winter as well. Style-based pieces like vintage jackets, like Vintage Wilsons leather and suede and fur-lined jackets can be a huge market. And I'm not kidding. If you look up comps on eBay, on Poshmark, on Depop, you're going to see some styles from Vintage Wilson selling over $100. We've sold certain styles from Vintage Wilsons for over $150 ourselves. It all depends on the style and what keywords you're using to uplift value. And if you're looking at me and you're like, I don't even know, what keywords do I use? It's going to depend highly on the piece you have. So the beautiful thing about vintage is you can market it to the eye of the beholder. You can look at a piece and basically bring value, put the value on your item, and market it with style aesthetic keywords that we often talk about it on this channel in order to get your item in the right buyer's eyes. So if they're looking for a grunge leather jacket, maybe you can find the perfect grunge Wilsons leather jacket. Okay, let's move on to number two. So number two is something that I have been sourcing heavily for years, and it's only growing more popular. It is Vintage Juicy Couture. Yeah, you heard me right. It's Juicy Couture. If this is giving you nightmares from your childhood or your past, I'm so sorry. But wow, all I can say is holy Y2K. Y2K is in. Y2K is in demand more than ever, and it's not stopping. I don't see it stopping anytime soon. It is only growing more popular. And with Y2K comes the resurgence of Y2K nostalgia. Remember, with vintage pieces, it's all about that nostalgia. What kind of emotions does it bring up for people? And they want those pieces that they had in their closet from decades and years past. Oh, and they're willing to buy it online at a steep price, because guess what? They're no longer made anymore in the same way. And that is why vintage pieces hold so much more value sometimes than modern brands. And I always like to say, I would love to find a vintage bolo, a vintage golden item way more than any pair of Lululemon leggings in a bin. And I will say this, if there's one piece I'd love to find every single time I go sourcing, it is a vintage Juicy Couture tracksuit. I'm talking the full nines, right? Like Paris Hilton is on a red carpet. She's wearing her pink bejeweled Juicy Couture tracksuit. I want that. I want to find that every single time I go sourcing, because you're literally finding $100, $100, $100. I just checked comps on this again, and solds are still strong. I even saw one that sold for $140 for a Juicy Couture set. That's absolutely insane. And of course, you have more value when you have both pieces, so I'm always on the eye for both the jacket and the pants. But other categories perform so well as well. Definitely take a look at different categories in Juicy Couture online and check those comps, because bags and Juicy Couture are really getting a pretty penny if they are true vintage. I do want to call that out with Juicy Couture, especially if you have been finding some Juicy Couture tags. There are certain indicators that you can look up to make sure that yours are actually vintage Y2K. One big one is that it should say made in the USA, and if you want to learn more, there's such a good rabbit hole that you can go on. Just Google Juicy Couture Y2K tags, and there's a ton of research and info up there. That is where I deep dive to learn, okay, what tags do I really look out for? Because knowing vintage tags makes a difference when you're outsourcing, so that you can have the edge. Okay, last up. I saved this for last, but this has been probably the most consistent, I would say. The absolute workhorse of all vintage bolos that we have sourced for years. And again, in certain categories, this is only increasing in value, which I love to see. Honestly, now that I'm thinking about it, all three of these brands they're all increasing in value. Vintage Wilsons, especially this winter with certain trends that are so in demand, selling for more now than they were 2 years ago. Juicy Couture, that has definitely been blowing up over the years. And number 3, vintage Levi's. So we could literally spend a whole video just on vintage Levi's alone, and it would be probably over an hour. There are literal deep dives on YouTube that are hours long, fully dedicated to just researching vintage Levi's tags, vintage Levi's style codes, the types of buttons, the types of rivets, the types of zippers. There's so much. There's truly so much. And honestly, this is something that I deep dive myself. I go down the rabbit hole on YouTube. I go down the rabbit hole on blogs. And especially when I had no clue about what vintage to find, I actually think the first thing I went ahead and I wanted to start researching was vintage Levi's. So I found some vintage Levi's Facebook groups. I looked up these YouTube videos and I sat down and I asked myself, okay, I need to know what to look for when it comes to vintage Levi's so that I can actually find these when I'm out in the wild. There's no reason for me not to look at every single pair of Levi's jeans I'm seeing, give it a quick look, give it a quick glance to see if it actually has that check mark on any of the boxes I'm looking for, and then keep going if not. And wow, I'm like hitting myself, honestly, for all the times I've probably just passed on vintage Levi's in different styles. Now that I know how much of a gold mine it truly can be. There was one time at a flea market when we lived in Texas, and we only went to the flea markets a few times in Texas because, boy, it is hot. It is way too hot to do some outside sourcing, and I'm hitting myself because I think back on this all the time. There was this one seller at the flea market, and this was right at the beginning of like my vintage journey. I was figuring out, okay, I can sell vintage. What should I look for? Men's vintage has always been hard for me. Now I love men's vintage, but at the time I was scared. And that means vintage Levi's are scary. So we were at the flea market and there was this one seller that had the absolute boatload of Levi's, and a lot of them were vintage, and he was not upcharging for them. They were all between like $3 and $5 each. They were almost all this one style of vintage Levi's. It was the 501XX style, and a lot of them were made in the USA. Those two things are two things I actively look out for. Even now, I only think I found a few this year of that style. He had so many. I was so scared to buy him out that I only bought 10, and I remember them all selling within that month with all of them, almost over $50, every single one of them. And this was years ago too. And I was so heartbroken because I went back and he wasn't there. And it's just such a good case of you don't know. If you don't know what you're looking for, you're not going to find it, right? And especially at that time, I didn't have that confidence to pay up, right? Like $5 is not exactly paying up. But for me, it was, oh my God, I don't want to buy like 50 of these all in one shot. I wish I did. And that is why I say to you, if you are not looking up Levi styles when you find them, not making sure that you understand the difference between vintage Levi's and modern Levi's, go down the same rabbit holes that I did. There are so many good YouTube videos out there, and a few common things that I can give you to look for that really help me is certain tags lend itself to modern versus vintage very easily. Paper tags are a common indicator that something is going to be older or vintage. Certain things like made in USA, if you see that on a pair of Levi's, that's a good indicator that it might be vintage as well. And now, these are a couple things that add value in vintage Levi's that you're gonna want to write down. Anytime, literally anytime you find any of these factors, you need to take a second look at it. If you see a big E on the little tag on the back of Levi's jeans, there is a Levi's little patch that is often on the right pocket. If the E in Levi's is uppercase and it's vintage, gold. Absolutely gold. I do want to say real quick though, this is being reproduced. So there are certain modern Levi's that also now have the big E as well because it is so wildly popular. Of course, Levi's is going to go ahead and reproduce them. If you find one that is vintage though, that is a pretty penny. Selvage denim in all brands are definitely going to add value. The case is also true with Levi's. If you have vintage Levi's selvage denim, you've hit a gold mine. Orange tab is another indicator of quality. If that little Levi's tag that I told you guys on the back is also an orange tab, and now put all those three together, now you have something that is worth hundreds, if not thousands. And again, the older, the better. So there's a big difference between, for example, I found a bunch of probably 1990s vintage Levi's jeans at that flea market. All of them really great pieces, right? $50 to $100 sales. Let's say I found one from the 1950s. That's a big difference. That is a big jump. There is a huge jump in value when it comes to vintage Levi's, which is why, number one, you have to be able to recognize if you might have an older piece. That's the first thing I want you to take away from this video. If you're skipping on every single Levi's jeans and you're not even taking a second look, Start right now. Start the next time you go thrifting. Start to actually familiarize yourself with what tags are vintage, what tags are not, and then you can leave dating for later because dating your vintage Levi's is super important as well. And one more factor to look out for is, again, that made in USA. So I was prompted to put this in a video because recently I found probably one of my best vintage Levi's finds to date this past month. I found a vintage orange tab, big E, made in the USA bell-bottom flare jeans from Levi's. I am still trying to date them because, again, it does make a difference, right? Like, how vintage are they? Are they from the 80s? Are they from the 60s? Are they 70s? So they're in a pile for me to do research on, and I'll update you guys as I do research on them, but they are looking to be worth at least a couple $100. And you guys, it wasn't even in a new bin at the Goodwill outlet because sometimes it is so easy to just toss aside all of those jeans if you're at the Goodwill outlet or just skip right past them at the thrift store and not just give them a second look. All Levi's are not created equally. Some can be worth a ton of money. Okay. Those are my 3 vintage brands and vintage BOLOs I wanted to share with you. All of them have BOLOs within them, right? They have BOLO categories, they have BOLO items. That is such a cool thing about vintage and why once you start learning, I promise you, it is going to be so fun. You're not going to want to stop. So today we went over vintage Wilson's, vintage Juicy Couture, and vintage Levi's. If you guys do like this type of content, let me know and I can always create a part 2. Honestly, I had a list of like 10 just rattling around in my brain. It was hard to narrow it down to just these 3. So I definitely have more lists of these to make for you guys if you want them. So if you are interested, let me know in the comments so I can get to making more videos like this for you guys and more vintage BOLO series. All right, you guys, thank you so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe if you like this kind of content, and I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.